cybernetics as the efficient organon, actually the obsolescence of knowledge and subjectivity. Now, slide please, which is the first slide. Alright, now here we have the actual table of contents that I'm going to talk about. We have the basically we're going to talk about what cybernetics is. Then we're going to onto Heidegger and his conflation of cybernetics with technoscience. Then we're going to investigate Plato and technology and Aristotle. Then we're going to finish with socialism and cybernetics. All right, now with the introduction. Next slide, please. The term cybernetics usually refers to a discipline mainly invented and developed by Wiener in the late 40s and 50s. Now, it was almost forgotten and quite dead by the 80s, but it was actually a kind of premature burial, so to say, because it was not even close to finished, and when everyone forgot the main themes of cybernetics and declared it obsolete as a scientific discipline, which had promised much but delivered nothing. Now, this was actually falsely identified as a scientific discipline, for it never was such a thing, at least not in its essence. From the beginning, something much more fundamental was at stake, and the enthusiastic claims by some of the most important philosophers and theoreticians of the time compel us to bring out and study in full the life and afterlife of cybernetics as more than a discipline. For it is so ubiquitous that it has almost become invisible, constituting a world of its own. Now, among the early admirers, we have Simondon, we have Lacan, we have Heidegger, different quotations about the importance of cybernetics. We're not going to talk about them now. In what follows, I will use the term organon as to implicate both of its semantic trajectories. The term implies both a logic of access, or as Simondon called cybernetics, a schema of intelligibility, and then as a organ, or as an instrument, or as a prosthesis. As such, this efficient organon finds its revealing manifestations, respectively, in the logic behind 19th century synchronization of clocks at train stations, and the feedback mechanisms of Wiener's late 1940s predictor. Now, cybernetics seems to manifest. Next slide, please. Would we have? Cybernetics seems to manifest itself for the first time in the 19th century. Actually, Benninger and Tigan rightly traced the origin of cybernetics to the beginning of American railroad boom. The importance of the railroad and its trains in terms of capital and circulation is of course obvious, and thus avoiding any collision or delay or so forth was the primary shape that concern for efficiency took at the time. Now, this is where control problems, as Benninger calls them, first come into being, and the solution that was provided is synchronized clocks and timetables in every station. As Lacan also mentions in his discussion of cybernetics, this synchronization is of immense importance. For the first time, would we have the next slide, please? The clock, which was a word revealing equipment, and told the time, or tells the time according to the local parameters of the person keeping the time, such as Earth's rotation, position with regard to the sun, etc., is transformed into a cybernetic device of control. Next slide, please. Now, all the stations, regardless of their location, will show the same time. The clocks are separated from the world. They are no longer clocks, actually, rather stimulations of their former selves that are now control devices linked to the cybernetic capitalistic network of efficiency. Now, we're going to what is cybernetics proper. It is in Ashby's early introduction. Will we have a next slide, please? It is in Ashby's introduction to cybernetics that we find the distilled nature of cybernetic organon expressed in a concise statement of methodology. Now, it says that cybernetics is what does not ask what is this thing, but what does it do? Now, here we have a declaration of independence from all questions of being, whatness, and whyness, I guess, and which actually places us at the apex of the course of what Stigler calls the destitution of knowledge. Now, here we also find the primary operation of the cybernetic logic, whereby knowledge, as science or otherwise, is rendered obsolete, namely the protocol. Now, Ashby defines protocol as a list of the outputs generated by a black box coupled to the inputs that provoke them. This is the very essence of what is now progressively taking the place of science, with behavioral sciences and cognitive sciences as its forerunners. These sciences actually are the prime examples of sciences dominated by the cybernetic logic and in transitional states. They are more like research projects aimed at coming up with the maximum efficient protocol or input-output table for the human being. Now, with the cybernetic, ORGANON, Kant's dark room is turned inside out when the black box makes a virtue of unknowing. According to the cybernetic schema, knowledge, once judged to be an inseparable ingredient of maximum mastery of nature and efficient action by the Baconian organon, is now considered a hindrance to maximally efficient actions. The human mind or spirit is thus short-circuited to achieve the efficiency of pure calculation without representation. Stigler too engages the disappearance of knowledge, saying the enlightenment has been inverted into darkness. Slide please. As regards to what the cybernetic organon in its prosthesis form is, we can say that the more pure examples would be Wiener's predictor or Brooks's behavior-based robotics or robots, flash trading software used in Wall Street, so on and so forth. Now, what is important is that cybernetic prosthesis is what, using feedback, it connects onto the milieu or problem, and by regulating itself to it, changes its own structure as the need arises. Thus, it becomes specialized in handling that. It becomes hypertelic, actually, and maximally efficient in its task. The role of the human designer is completely removed and made obsolete in this case. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, we're going to Heidegger's mistake. Heidegger rightly believes that technoscience is part of the epistemic endeavors of human beings. In other words, he actually tells us that cybernetics is, tells us that technoscience, although calculative in nature, still provides Dasein with ways to know itself, providing a word picture and facilitating Dasein's inquiry into being. Now, calculating thought is thus coupled for Heidegger with its representation, Vorstellung, and representational knowledge. And research is an endeavor that begets knowledge which man uses to represent to himself his relation to the world. the relations between calculation, representation, and science are traced back to Leibniz's principle of reason or ground or ratio, whereby grounding as explanation or account is seen as fundamental for human judgment and the possibility of science. And here on the slide we have that the reason that Heidegger never dissociates the representational calculative is that he believes in the complete dominion of the principle of sufficient reason. Cybernetics, however, breaks away from the rule of the ratio and sufficient reason by letting go of the why and the what in favor of greater efficiency. Through the cybernetic organon, machines emerge that are not knowledge-based and not representational. Heidegger's mistake is that he does not differentiate the cybernetic from the technological proper, or rather, that he cannot conceive of calculation without representation. But by recognizing the abysmal difference between cybernetics and technoscience, we might yet undo the confounding of the two and think the possibility of the benevolence of what Michel Sorel calls Venusian science, by recognizing the fact that it shares with all poetic forms of thought the need for human knowledge and human engagement with the world. Now, in discussing the ground, or the want, we see Heidegger as unable to think beyond the industrial age of the atom in order to recognize the approaching horizon of non-representational thought. Believing the last word of the life of the contemporary human to be information, he is incapable of looking beyond to the ever more horrifying possibility of data. Now, the essence of knowledge in research, which is the meeting place of techniques and science, is inherently bound to and grounded in the specific realms of nature or history in which it is deployed as a procedure. Now, this involves the opening up and this involves the opening of spheres for such procedures through the fundamental act of research itself. And this is quoting Heidegger quote, this is accomplished through the projection within some realm of what is in nature, for example, of a fixed ground plan of natural events. The ground plan of natural events. Research designs in advance the manner in which the knowing procedure must ground itself and adhere to the sphere open up. Now, this clearly characterizes research as involving forms of predictive planning, modeling, or designing, sort of foreknowledge, and like scientific hypothesis, modeling, algorithm, and precedes that determines the research as deployment. In fact, Heidegger goes on to locate this antecedence in the very nature of mathematics. Ta mathemata, this is quoting Heidegger, ta mathemata means for the Greeks that which man knows in advance of his observation of whatever is and in his intercourse with things. Science then presupposes some fixed ground plan. Now, it is exactly this essential aspect, this foreknowledge, that can never be reconciled with the cybernetic hypothesis. Now, by virtue of its feedback mechanisms and black box logic, cybernetics is both indeterminate, functionally indeterminate, and singularly adapted. It operates in circuits and abolishes the rectilinear line of predictive modeling. For example, when a cybernetic device is presented or unleashed on a milieu, it does not start with the modeling, but actually starts in the dark and works itself by input-output recognition. Anyway, the very tendency of the cybernetic organon, as opposed to the Baconian organon of the ratio, lies in what Simondon identified as hypertelia, the over-specialization of machines to their milieus. The cybernetic skips the universal individual relation or spectrum that is at work in the process of judgment and human notion of truth, and speaks only at the level of the singular and the generic, which of course are beyond, usually taken to be beyond individuation. Now, within the immanence of cybernetics, this is actually, we're going to talk about the threats to Dasein, which is the next slide, please. Within the immanence of cybernetics, which flattens the human being and renders subjectivity obsolete, because actually cybernetics does not allow for representation. The subject-object relation collapses in on itself. With the distance eradicated in the name of efficiency, there is no longer any possibility of any Gegenstand, because simply there is no Gegen and no Stand to be had in the immanence of the cybernetic organon. The possibility of Stand is also just like the possibility of Stellen and Stellung eradicated, so that we have the impossibility of Vorstellung and even Gestalt in the domination of non-representational, calculative, efficient organon. So that sometimes, perhaps we can think beyond the Gestalt as the originary site of technical being. Now, the threat to Dasein comes in more than one way. Besides the removal of the opening that representational thought presented for Dasein's understanding, cybernetic bars access to the world. This is one of the most important notions of cybernetics as it spreads to all areas of life today, today's capitalism. The cybernetic processes not only take over the task of the body, but also that of the mind. This is proletarianization, of course, and it performs so flawlessly that the world is gradually removed from the sphere of human care and human access. No longer is the Dasein engaged in umsichtig or a circumspective care with the world, because handling the world problem on behalf of humans, cybernetics takes away the world through which, through online in which Dasein could come to understand itself and take a stand on its own existence. So, Plato's machines and Aristotle's types of knowledge. Next slide, please. More a language machine, more than a language machine, writing for Plato is, or rather fails to be, a meaning machine. In demanding that writing answer questions and say new things in response to new situations and questions, is a demand for complete functional indetermination and simultaneously hypertelic adaptivity. The cybernetic processes, as I later shall show, just like the cybernetic logic, constitutes a capacity for transit between the generic and the singular, or the hypertelic, without having to pass through the universal particular spectrum of individuation. Now, the ideal processes would be some endlessly transformable device that structures itself according to the situation in which it is placed. Now, studying Plato, Stigler focuses on the notions of hypomnesis and anamnesis, and by focusing on techniques as exteriorization of memory, he manages to develop a theory of proletarianization that goes to the very heart of today's crisis-ridden capitalism. There is, however, a slightly different way to read Plato's objections against writing, a way that might let us glimpse the concrete processes involved in that proletarianization. Now, as we know, one of the main compliments that Plato actually levies against the written word is that it's incapable of adapting itself to the changes in its milieu. That is, it cannot answer new questions or generally interact with the reader. More simply stated, the word, qua meaning machine, cannot change itself adapt itself, etc., and thus always remains secondary to the human mind, quite designer, quite creative, the one who reprograms the machine, rewrites the text, or creates new ones according to the situations that arise. Now, Plato's objection will be revived again and again throughout the history of philosophy, but perhaps the most influential revival is done by Alan Turing. In his famous paper on computable numbers, after establishing the notions of computability and the presentation of non-computable numbers, he symbolizes them by delta, he briefly states that it is possible that any assigned number of figures of delta, or the computable number, can be calculated, but not by a uniform process. When sufficiently many figures of delta have been calculated, an essentially new method is necessary in order to obtain more figures. Now, the design of new methods, a shift in direction, is again considered as exclusive to the human race. This comforting thought will soon be shattered by the invention of feedback. In fact, the cybernetic organon might even be thought of as a kind of seeing these objections of Plato, Descartes, Alan Turing, etc., as a challenge instead of a statement of fact, and taking up that challenge actually. Now, separating episteme, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, separating episteme from techne rightly constitutes the beginning of philosophy within a political register. Episteme has become the model for human creativity and adaptability with regard to changing milieus. This notion is what inspires images of speaking, conscious, humanoid robots or other AI fantasy creatures or things partaking of the human mentality or spirituality. Now, regarding AI, it must be said that as long as it equals, an aim to create an artificial consciousness or mind, it is already passé in its very inception. Now, because here we know that consciousness, whether human or artificial, is too inefficient, too time-consuming. The brain that is to be placed at the crown of the prosthetic god is more a general problem solver, delegated with handling the war, than a human mind or spirit or any other kind of mind. Jean-Pierre Dupuy sums this up by stating that cybernetics was not concerned with making the machine human, it was concerned with mechanizing the human. A look at Fernand Vendôme's attempt at an epistemology of cybernetics might be highly illuminating here. Now, he is talking about knowledge, but his knowledge can be read as a kind of an operation or procedure. Maximal efficient knowledge of a domain can be seen as the minimal structuration, which is sufficient for fulfilling the relevant functions, taking into account the context and situation in which the domain is embedded. This minimal structuration does fall into case. This requirement of minimality can then be loosened locally for the sake of protection of the self. Now, the last sentence is very interesting, although no further comment is made on it. And there we learn that the price of sustaining a self or a core of identity is inefficiency. That is why there can be no individuation or any identity, self or subjectivity in or through the cybernetic organon. Next slide, please. Now, in a way, the cybernetic processes has finally actualized the dream of the sophist, i.e., to do something in the most efficient manner without any knowledge acquisition. Protagoras stands vindicated here. Now, it is very important to realize that the independence of the cybernetic machine from the designer or the engineer, and we need to see the revolution of the feedback mechanism. Even in the most primitive feedback machine lies the potential obsolescence of the human designer. Cybernetics terminates the cult of the engineer and the bricoleur. With the cybernetic organon, we witness a new form of telos, a new form of hypertelia, the most generic and indeterminate machine adapts itself to totally to its milieux, from the absolutely generic to the singular, without traversing the intermediate spectrum of individuation, which is the very essence of human knowledge and judgment. Actually, I'm going to say this very quick. In studies done on war soldiers in war, this connecting of the sub-subjective, the bodily, with the supra-subjective grand strategy or the politics is very much studied and proven to be very common these days. The extent of the difference between cybernetics and technology per se can be demonstrated by referring to the first paragraph of Aristotle's Metaphysics. There, Aristotle provides a revealing illustration of the universal nature of techne. Let me see about the... would we please move 2 slides forward to Aristotle and knowledge? As compared, he actually differentiates, he provides a revealing illustration of the universal nature of techne as compared to experience and memory. It is said that in the matters of curing or healing the sick, mere experience, immanent and concrete, while held in low esteem, is much more likely to succeed than the application of the medical art or technique. In the latter case, the physician has undergone a learning process by the dint of which he has come to know some universals that are by nature abstract. She then has to make a judgment about subsuming the singular case at hand under the universal as an individual. In this, as in most reasoning practices, and most especially in those of the Cartesian method, we can clearly detect the working of judgment or individuation in between the problem and its solution. In cybernetics, however, especially in the works of Wiener, especially in works like Wiener's Predictor, we have the eradication of all of this all-too-human intermediary step, which is universal individuation, in favor of the protocol-based immanent approach. Now, would we please have the next slide? Now, we're going onto the final part, the conclusion called socialism, and cybernetics. Now, the end of politics, the start of what? In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels depict the communist society in terms of a substitution of association for competition as a way to maximize the efficiency of production. For them, capitalism was inefficient in its Planlosigkeit, planlessness. In their idea for connecting everyone with all means of production, they already approached the logic of cybernetic maximization. Indeed, as Wallerstein rightly says, efficiency was perhaps the only shared ideal of both the liberal and the socialist ideology. For Marx, for example, in German ideology, we read that the aim was more to end labor altogether than end the working class. Das Reich der Freiheit beginnt in der Tat erst da, wo das Arbeiten aufhört. Cybernetics is not only dehumanizing, but also depoliticizing. Eradicating subjectivity and the capacity for for decision making for decision making or judgment, which forms the basis of individual political capacity, it does away with politics altogether. The end of politics coincides with the end of necessity, and there is certainly no better way to deal with the necessary than cybernetics, which not only takes over labor of the body, but also the intelligence of the mind, or the labor of the mind, and causes for a proletarianization of both. Now, next slide, please. Very early on, Allende, the Chilean short-time president, understood the truth of the cybernetic organon recently brought to life in the shape of computers and information systems. Allende saw cybernetics as the end or the obsolescence of politics. With the then futuristic command room built by Stafford Beer, the Chilean social government came perhaps closer than any other socialist country to the realization of the withering away of the state. Once realized, the cybernetic apparatus would ensure, or perhaps enforce, the realization of the purely administrative government without any interval of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and rather we might say, in a more or less playful manner, that Beer's system would entail the proletarianization of the entire populace, who would then be placed under the dictatorship of the cybernetic machine. Whether or not such systems may be said to exist already in the capitalistic Western world, we must be prepared to reassess Marx's prophecies regarding the inevitable transition from capitalism into socialism and onto the classless society. In a horrifyingly ironic manner, this thesis seems to be coming through, although its actualized form has something of the monstrous in it. Like Kronos, the father of Zeus, capitalism has swallowed and integrated the changes of socialism and has thus ensured its own immortality, and seems to be going towards that end of labor thing. Now, it seems that now about the new beginnings would be next. Please change slides. It seems that the cybernetic organon is in the process of bringing about a return of the otium, the condition of perfect disentanglement from all things, reactivating the vita contemplativa in the search for useless truth. Perhaps there can be some new individuations after this short-circuiting. Banished to the domain of the useless, knowledge now takes the place assigned to it, qua Sophia, by Aristotle. If the freeing of the hand and the dawn of techniques were correlated, then perhaps we will witness a sort of liberation of the mind with the dawn of the cybernetic age. Were it not for the utter lack of politics in the sphere of access, one could say that the Greek Renaissance was in the offing. But then again, Aristotle did designate politics too as a necessity, and thus unfit for the free man engaged in the pursuit of knowledge in the quiet of the vita contemplativa. This is it. Thank you.